She was standing in the middle of a hotel ballroom with 400 people watching her, and she was not crying. That was the thing people remembered later, not what was said, not the laughter that rippled through the room, not the way the microphone squealed when it was handed to the wrong person at the wrong moment. What people remembered was that Margaret Calloway did not cry. She stood very still. Her hands were at her sides. Her dark green dress caught the light in a way that nobody in that room would have anticipated, because nobody in that room, not one person out of 400, knew what Margaret Calloway actually was. They thought they did. They thought they had figured her out years ago. They were wrong. But that is the thing about underestimating a person who has spent a decade learning to be patient. You do not discover your mistake all at once. You discover it the way you discover a crack in a foundation, slowly at first, then with a kind of terrible speed that makes you understand you have been standing on failing ground for a very long time. This is the story of how Margaret Calloway stood still when she could have walked away, and what happened when the moment she had been quietly, carefully preparing for finally arrived. Before we continue, to our new viewers joining today, subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and I enjoy recognizing and welcoming members of our growing family. Today's warm shout-out goes to Maria from the United States, Margaret from South Africa, and Juliet from Jamaica. Thank you for being part of our family. Subscribe now and comment below so I can welcome you too. It was a Thursday evening in early November, and the city of Hartford, Connecticut had the particular cold quality it always gets in that season, the kind that settles into the bones before you realize you have stopped being warm. The event was the annual dinner of the Northeast Regional Business Alliance, held at the Grand Marquette Hotel on Elm Street, a venue that had hosted fundraisers and retirement parties and at least 2 weddings that Margaret knew about personally. The ballroom smelled the way hotel ballrooms always smell, like warm bread, cut flowers that have been standing in water too long, and a faint undertone of carpet cleaner beneath it all. Margaret had arrived at 6:15. She had sat down at table 11, which was set slightly to the left of the main stage, close enough to see clearly but far enough that the overhead speakers did not overwhelm conversation. She had ordered water. She had straightened the fork beside her plate. She had done all the small, habitual things a person does when they are accustomed to arriving somewhere and waiting for someone else to define the evening. Her husband arrived at 6:47. His name was Douglas Calloway, and he entered the room the way he always entered rooms, with a kind of forward momentum, his right hand already extended, his voice already raised in recognition of someone across the space. Douglas was 53 years old and had spent the last 19 of those years building a commercial real estate consultancy that had made him, in the estimation of Hartford's professional community, a person of consequence. He believed in firm handshakes and follow-through and the idea that a man's reputation was the most valuable thing he owned. He believed these things genuinely. That was part of what made the evening so difficult to understand, even now. He found his way to table 11 and leaned down and kissed Margaret on the cheek in the perfunctory way of a man who has kissed the same cheek a great many times and no longer fully registers the act. "You look nice," he said. "Thank you," she said. And that was, more or less, the depth of their exchange for the next 40 minutes. The dinner proceeded through its predictable stages, the salad course, the roll baskets, the main course of chicken piccata that had been sitting under warming lights slightly too long. Around the room, Douglas worked. That was the right word for it. He moved from table to table with his water glass, maintaining relationships, reinforcing impressions, depositing small professional courtesies like a man tending a garden he intended to harvest later. Margaret watched this and felt something she had become very familiar with over the years, a kind of steady, quiet ache that had less to do with anger than with recognition. She recognized what she was looking at. She had recognized it for a long time. The program began at 8 o'clock. There was an award segment, and 3 people were honored for contributions to regional economic development. There were brief speeches. There was applause in the measured, professional way of people who applaud because it is expected rather than because they are moved. And then Douglas Calloway was called to the stage to introduce the evening's keynote speaker. He was good at this. Margaret had seen him do it many times. He had a quality of ease at a microphone that came from genuine comfort with attention, and the room responded to it the way rooms always did, leaning slightly forward, settling in, ready to be entertained. He told a story about the keynote speaker. He drew a mild laugh from the crowd. He was warm and professional and precise. And then, in the way that the worst moments often arrive, the thing happened that nobody who was not Douglas Calloway could have anticipated. Someone in the second row, a colleague, a man named Philip Hennessy who had known Douglas for 11 years, called out a comment meant for Douglas's ears only, but delivered at a volume that traveled considerably farther than intended. What Philip said was, "Better you than Margaret at the podium. She'd have us all asleep in 5 minutes." It was the kind of comment that lives in the gray zone between cruelty and carelessness, the kind that emerges from a certain type of professional closeness where small diminishments are mistaken for affection. Philip had not thought about it. He had simply said it. And Douglas, instead of letting the moment pass, instead of redirecting with the grace of a man who actually respected the woman he had married, instead of doing any of the things a person does when they understand that a joke at someone else's expense reflects more on the joker than the target, Douglas Calloway laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was not the brief, deflecting laugh of a man who is embarrassed. It was the laugh of a man who had, in that unguarded moment, shown something he had been keeping behind the surface of his marriage for a very long time. The room shifted. Some people smiled uncertainly. Others looked down at their plates. A few looked at table 11. Margaret Calloway looked back at them. She did not look away. She did not reach for her water glass. She did not adjust her expression into the half-smile that women learn to deploy as a form of social armor. She simply sat, and she looked at the people who were looking at her, and she let the moment be exactly what it was. But to understand what happened next, to understand what Margaret was doing in that ballroom and why her stillness meant something different than it might have appeared, you would need to go back. Not far. Just 12 years. Just to the beginning. Margaret Hargrove had grown up in Deerfield, Massachusetts, the younger of 2 children in a family that ran a regional insurance brokerage founded by her grandfather in 1961. Her father, Raymond Hargrove, was a deliberate, measured man who believed that the most important quality a person could develop was the ability to read a room and wait. He used to say that knowledge was most useful when the person who had it was the last to reveal it. Margaret had listened to this when she was 9 years old and had not fully understood it. She understood it now. She had met Douglas at a professional conference in Providence when she was 31. He was 36, recently divorced, successful in the way that immediately announces itself in a room. He had attended her panel presentation, she had been speaking about consolidation trends in the insurance sector, and had introduced himself afterward with the specific energy of a man who has been impressed by something he did not expect. Their courtship was 2 years of dinners and travel and the particular intensity of 2 people in their 30s who understand that they are not practicing anymore. When he proposed, she said yes with a clarity that she had not doubted for a single day. What she had not anticipated, what she could not have anticipated, because it did not reveal itself all at once, was the way the shape of their partnership would shift once the wedding was over. It happened the way erosion happens. Not in a single dramatic event, but in the accumulation of small adjustments. There was the matter of the business. Margaret had been a regional vice president at her family's brokerage when they married. The firm was growing. She was its operational lead, responsible for a portfolio of commercial accounts across 4 New England states. It was not glamorous work, but it was serious work, and she was good at it in the unhurried, thorough way of someone who had been trained to value precision over visibility. Douglas, in the early years of their marriage, had expressed genuine interest in her career. He had asked questions. He had attended her professional dinners. He had, in those first years, treated her work as a thing of consequence. Somewhere in the middle years, that changed. It did not change with a conversation or an argument. It changed with an absence of attention, the kind of change that happens when someone stops asking follow-up questions. When the dinner conversation shifts entirely to one person's professional world and the other person begins to fill the silence with listening rather than speaking. When a woman learns, through accumulated evidence rather than direct statement, that her husband has decided her work is context rather than content. Margaret had noticed this shift. She had felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the actual rain, through a quality of the air, a pressure adjustment. She had not confronted it directly, because she was her father's daughter, and her father's daughter knew how to read a room and wait. But she had not been idle. In the 4th year of their marriage, her father called her from his office in Deerfield with a voice that was more careful than usual. "I need to talk to you about the firm," he said. "I'm listening," she said. What he told her was that the family brokerage, the company her grandfather had built and her father had grown, was in a position that neither of them had discussed openly because they were both the kind of people who processed serious information privately before bringing it into conversation. The firm's largest regional competitor had approached them about an acquisition. The offer was significant. Her father was 67 years old and had been managing a mild heart condition for 2 years. Her brother, Thomas, who had nominally been positioned to inherit leadership, had in practice shown less interest in the operational realities of the business than in the social life that came with carrying the family name. Her father's question was not, "Should we sell?" His question was, "Are you ready?" Margaret had driven to Deerfield on a Saturday morning in March, and she and her father had sat at the kitchen table in the house where she had grown up, with coffee cups between them and a legal pad on which her father had written a series of numbers, and they had talked for 4 hours. What came out of that conversation was a plan. A quiet, deliberate, unhurried plan of the kind that takes years to execute. Margaret's father would not sell to the competitor. Instead, he would restructure. He would gradually, through a series of transactions that would be documented carefully and handled by attorneys who understood how to move assets through a family business without announcing the movement, transfer operational and ownership authority in a way that positioned Margaret not as an employee or vice president but as the controlling interest. This process took 3 years. Margaret had said nothing to Douglas about any of it. Not because she intended to deceive him, but because she was watching something, and she had not yet decided what she was watching. She was watching to see whether the man she had married understood her. And year by year, small moment by small moment, she was getting her answer. There is something worth pausing for here, something that this story asks of anyone willing to sit with it honestly. We all carry assumptions about the people closest to us. We assign them roles: the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who handles the logistics, the one who needs to be managed. These roles feel like observations, but they are often just habits of attention. We stop truly looking at a person because we believe we have already seen them. The question this story raises is a difficult one. How many of the people in your life have you stopped truly looking at? And what might you discover if you looked again, with the same curiosity you had at the very beginning? Take a moment with that, if you like. In the 7th year of their marriage, Margaret became the majority owner and president of Hargrove Regional Insurance Partners, a firm that at that point held accounts across 5 New England states, maintained a reserve portfolio worth considerably more than anyone outside the family's immediate circle would have estimated, and had just completed a strategic acquisition of a smaller Vermont-based brokerage that expanded its commercial client base by a third. She went to work every morning. She came home in the evenings. She made dinner on the nights they did not have engagements. She attended Douglas's professional events and sat at table 11 and table 7 and table 4 and listened to the conversations of people who believed they understood who she was. She did not hide her work, precisely. But she did not advertise it. When Douglas asked, in the casual way of a man performing the ritual of interest rather than genuinely practicing it, how things were going at the office, she gave accurate, brief answers that satisfied the form of the question without filling it with content. "Things are steady," she would say. "Good," he would say. And the conversation would move on. There were moments when she considered a different approach. There were evenings, particularly in the years when she was managing the acquisition process and working with her father's attorneys on the restructuring, when she would sit across from Douglas at dinner and think, "I could tell him. I could put it on the table the way he puts his work on the table. I could let him see what I am doing." But something always stopped her. It was not pride, though pride was there. It was not strategy, though strategy was there too. It was something quieter and sadder than either of those things. It was the knowledge that she had tried, in early years, to share this work with him, and the interest had not landed. The questions had not followed. The attention had moved on. She had eventually stopped offering what was not being received. In the 9th year of their marriage, Douglas began spending more time than usual in Boston. His consultancy had won a significant contract with a real estate development group operating out of the South End, and the work required regular travel. Margaret accepted this without particular concern. Douglas had always been a person who moved toward opportunity with genuine energy. But in the 10th year of their marriage, the trips to Boston became longer. The phone calls became briefer. The quality of Douglas's attention when he was home, which had never been particularly concentrated, began to feel like the attention of someone who is physically present but dwelling elsewhere. Margaret noticed. She did not respond immediately. She watched. In the early spring of the 11th year, her father called from Deerfield with the news that his cardiologist had recommended a surgical procedure, a bypass, not dramatic. The language was optimistic, but serious enough that Raymond Hargrove had begun talking about what he called arrangements, in the tone of a man who is being practical rather than afraid. Margaret drove to Deerfield on a Friday morning. She sat with her father in the kitchen again, and this time he told her something he had been holding for several months. "I had a conversation with Douglas," he said. Margaret looked at him. "He called me in January," her father said. "He was asking about the firm. Not about how you were doing. About the firm. About what it was worth and who else might be involved in the ownership structure." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, through the window above the sink, a cardinal landed briefly on the bare oak branch that had been growing in the same spot for as long as Margaret could remember, and then lifted away. "He was asking," Margaret said carefully, "or he was asking in a particular direction." Her father looked at her with the specific gentleness of a man who has raised a careful daughter and trusts her to understand an answer without having it translated. "He mentioned," her father said, "that he had a client group in Boston that was looking at regional insurance assets as part of a diversification strategy." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "I told him nothing he couldn't find in a public filing," her father said. "I know," Margaret said. She drove home that afternoon through the gray Massachusetts winter, and she thought very carefully about everything she knew, and everything she did not know, and the difference between the two. By the time she reached Hartford, she had made several decisions. She called her attorney on a Monday morning and asked for an appointment. She called her accountant on Tuesday. She called a woman named Dorothy Westfall, who had been her father's advisor for 20 years and who understood the geography of family business law in New England better than anyone Margaret had ever met. She did not tell Douglas any of this. Over the following 6 weeks, Margaret completed a set of legal and financial maneuvers that her advisors later described as among the most cleanly executed they had seen. The controlling interest in Hargrove Regional Insurance Partners, which had already been transferred to Margaret years earlier, was formalized and protected through a series of instruments that placed it beyond the reach of any claim from a marital estate, legally, properly, and with full documentation. She also hired a private attorney to begin reviewing the specific legal implications of what her father had told her, in the context of what she was beginning to understand about Douglas's activities in Boston. What that review eventually produced was not dramatic. It was not explosive. It was simply a documented understanding of a pattern. Douglas had been spending time in Boston with a woman named Carolyn Marsh, who worked in the development group that held his consulting contract. The relationship had been ongoing for approximately 14 months. There was documentation. There were hotel receipts. There were text messages that Douglas had sent from a phone register to his consultancy rather than his personal line, a detail that suggested he had thought, at some level, about being careful, which in turn meant he had thought, at some level, about being caught. Margaret read through this documentation on a Wednesday evening in her home office, with the door closed and a cup of tea growing cold on the corner of her desk. She felt, when she finished reading, something she had not entirely expected. She had expected anger. She had expected grief. She had expected the particular vertigo of discovering that a thing you suspected is true. What she felt, sitting in the quiet of her office with the documentation in her hands, was something closer to clarity. She had been watching for 11 years. She had watched a man fail, gradually and completely, to see her. She had watched him confuse her patience for passivity and her privacy for limitation. She had watched him grow comfortable with a version of her that had never been fully accurate. And now he had made a set of choices that she had not chosen for him, and the question before her was what to do with that. She sat with the tea until it was cold. She sat until the house was fully quiet. She thought about her grandfather, who had built a business with no advantages and considerable obstacles. She thought about her father, who had expanded that business through methods she was still learning from. She thought about her own 11 years of work, the accounts and the acquisitions and the careful, unglamorous labor of building something real. She thought about what she had earned and what she was not willing to lose. And then she picked up her phone and called Dorothy Westfall. This moment in Margaret's story carries something worth sitting with. There is a kind of pain that comes from being seen incorrectly by someone who should know you well. It is a particular pain, quieter than outright rejection, more corrosive than conflict. It happens in long-term relationships, in families, in workplaces, anywhere that people spend enough time together to create assumptions that calcify into facts. What this story asks us to consider is this. What is the cost of staying silent when you have been misread? And when is patience a form of wisdom, and when does it become a form of self-erasure? There is no single answer. But the question is worth carrying. Dorothy Westfall was 71 years old and had the manner of a woman who had heard everything and retained most of it. She had a small firm on Farmington Avenue with 2 junior associates and a receptionist named Earl who had been with her for 12 years. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had a habit, when listening to something consequential, of holding her glasses in her right hand and turning them slowly, as though the motion helped her process what she was hearing. When Margaret finished explaining what she knew and what she wanted, Dorothy held her glasses for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You've done most of the hard work already." "I know," Margaret said. "The business is protected." "Yes. So what you're asking me to do is manage the dissolution in a way that is orderly and complete and doesn't leave him with a narrative he can use." "That's right." Dorothy nodded slowly. "How much time do you want?" "Enough time," Margaret said, "to finish one thing." The one thing was this: there was a regional expansion initiative she had been developing for 18 months, a proposal to bring 3 additional brokerage offices in Connecticut and Rhode Island under the Hargrove umbrella, which would increase the firm's commercial footprint by 40% and create an operational infrastructure that would change what the company was in a way that could not be undone. Margaret needed 4 more months to complete it. So she said nothing to Douglas. She went home. She made dinner on the nights they did not have engagements. She sat beside him at table 11 and at table 7 and at table 4. She listened to the conversations of people who believed they understood who she was. And she finished her work. The expansion closed in early October. 3 offices. 41 new staff. A commercial account portfolio that placed Hargrove Regional Insurance Partners among the top 15 independent brokerages in New England, by revenue. Margaret signed the final documents on a Tuesday afternoon in Dorothy's office. She sat alone for a moment after the attorneys left the room. Outside, through a window that overlooked Farmington Avenue, she could see the trees in their late October color, red and amber and the particular deep gold that only happens for about a week each year before the leaves come down. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about her father in his kitchen in Deerfield, drinking coffee at the table where she had learned everything that mattered. She thought, this is what he meant. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and drove to the Northeast Regional Business Alliance dinner at the Grand Marquette Hotel on Elm Street. She arrived at 6:15. She sat at table 11. She ordered water. She straightened the fork beside her plate. When Douglas arrived at 6:47 and said, "You look nice," she said, "Thank you," and meant it in a way that was entirely her own, a private meaning, the kind that lives inside a fact before the fact is spoken. The dinner proceeded. The program began. Douglas went to the stage to introduce the keynote speaker. And then Philip Hennessy said what he said, and Douglas laughed. The room shifted. Some people smiled. Others looked down. A few looked at table 11. Margaret looked back at them. She sat very still. Because here is the thing about a moment you have been, in some sense, preparing for, it does not feel the way you imagined it would. There is no rush of heat, no roar of vindication. There is something more like arrival, the quiet sensation of having traveled a long distance and finally recognizing the place you intended to reach. The program concluded. The evening moved toward its end with the usual sounds, the pushing back of chairs, the resuming of conversation, the gathering of coats and programs and the small paper name cards that someone always pockets as a souvenir without fully understanding why. Douglas came back to table 11. He was warm in the way he always was after an evening that had gone well for him, a warmth that had nothing to do with her, but was available to her the way heat from a fire is available to someone standing nearby. He said, "Good evening." She looked at him. She said, "I'd like to talk to you at home." Something in her tone, not anger, not coldness, but a quality of settled intention that he had perhaps never heard from her before, made him go still for a moment. "Sure," he said. "Everything okay?" "Everything is very clear," she said. Which was true. They drove home separately, as they often did when they arrived separately. The house was a colonial on Greenfield Drive that they had bought 9 years earlier, with white trim and a yard that Margaret had always tended more carefully than Douglas had noticed. She arrived first. She hung her coat. She stood in the kitchen under the overhead light and felt the particular quiet of a house in which something is about to change. Douglas came in 20 minutes later. He found her at the kitchen table with 2 documents in front of her. The first was a summary, prepared by Dorothy Westfall's firm, of the legal status of Margaret's business assets, the ownership structure, the protected interests, the completed expansion. A document that told, in the dry language of legal summary, what Margaret Calloway actually was. The second was the divorce petition. Douglas looked at the table for a long time. He looked at Margaret. "How long," he said, and his voice had lost its professional ease, "have you been?" "Long enough," she said. Not cruelly. Simply accurately. There is a thing that happens sometimes when a person who has held all the assumptions suddenly has those assumptions removed. It is not always dramatic. It is often quiet, a quality of recalibration, the mind adjusting to a landscape that is not the landscape it expected. Douglas sat down. He picked up the first document. He read it. He set it down. He said, quietly and without the evasion she might have expected, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said. "That was a choice you made." He was quiet for a moment. "The call to your father." "Yes." He rubbed the side of his face in a gesture she recognized from 19 years of watching him think. "I wasn't, I want you to know that was not." "Douglas," she said. "You don't need to explain it to me. I understand what happened. I've understood it for a while." The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed in the way it always hummed. The clock above the stove showed 11:47. "Is this," he started. "Is there anything that would?" She looked at him with something that was not anger and not contempt. It was something more final than either of those, the look of a person who has done all the thinking that needs to be done and arrived somewhere they can stand on steadily. "No," she said. "There isn't." He nodded slowly. He picked up the divorce petition. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. He did not sign it that night. He signed it 3 days later, in Dorothy Westfall's office, after reviewing it with his own attorney, who had called Dorothy and then called Douglas back and said, in the professional shorthand of attorneys, "She's in a strong position. This is a fair document." It was a fair document. Margaret had made sure of that. She did not want more than she had built. She wanted what she had built. That was all. The divorce was finalized in the spring. Douglas retained his consultancy. He kept the car he preferred and the furniture he had chosen. He left the house on Greenfield Drive to Margaret, who had tended the yard for 9 years and knew where the drainage was slow in the corner by the fence and which window needed a new seal before the next winter. He moved to Boston within the year. Margaret heard, through the professional network they still nominally shared, that the relationship with Carolyn Marsh had not lasted past the first year after the divorce. She heard this without particular feeling, not satisfaction, not sympathy, but the mild neutrality of someone receiving information about a country they have visited and do not intend to return to. Her father had his surgery in the early spring, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. The procedure went well. Raymond Hargrove was home within 4 days, drinking coffee at the kitchen table in Deerfield with the particular dignity of a man who has survived a serious thing and knows it. When Margaret drove up on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after he came home, they sat at the table the way they always had, with coffee cups between them and the late March light coming in through the window above the sink. "I heard it went through," he said. "Yes," she said. "All of it?" "All of it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You did it the right way." She thought about the ballroom. About table 11. About the fork she had straightened and the water she had ordered and the way she had sat still while the room shifted around her. "I tried to," she said. Her father looked at her in the way he had always looked at her, not with the performative pride of a parent announcing that they are proud, but with something quieter and more durable. Recognition. The look of someone who sees what he is looking at. "Your grandfather," he said, "would have been impressed." She looked out the window. The oak branch was there, bare still in late March, but not the bareness of winter, the bareness of something preparing. "I learned it from you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You learned the patience from me. The rest of it was yours." People at the Northeast Regional Business Alliance talked about the November dinner for some time after it occurred. Not because of what happened at the podium. Philip Hennessy's comment had been absorbed and filed away in the way that small social cruelties usually are. Not because of Douglas's laugh, which most people had not registered with full attention. What people talked about was Margaret Calloway, or rather, what Margaret Calloway turned out to be. The news about the Hargrove expansion had moved through the regional business community in the way that news about significant transactions does, not immediately, not with fanfare, but steadily, the way water moves through porous ground. A woman named Susan Albright, who sat at table 6 on that November evening and had watched Margaret look back at the room without flinching, heard about the Hargrove acquisition in December and called a colleague to discuss it. Was that the woman at the Alliance dinner? The colleague asked. That was her, Susan said. There was a brief silence. The husband introduced the keynote. He did, Susan said. And she was just. She was at table 11, Susan said. She sat still the whole time. That, in some ways, was the most lasting detail. Not the business. Not the firm. Not the numbers. The sitting still. The quality of a person who knew something the room did not know, and chose not to announce it, and waited. Before this story reaches its ending, it is worth considering something about the way we understand strength. We tend to recognize strength when it is loud, when it announces itself in confrontations, in moments of visible triumph, in the kind of scenes that make for satisfying television. The person who stands up and says the thing no one else would say. The moment when everything turns. But there is another kind of strength that does not announce itself. It is the strength of continuing to do serious work when no one is paying attention. It is the strength of knowing your own value without requiring someone else to confirm it. It is the strength of sitting at table 11, watching a room that has misjudged you, and choosing not to correct its misunderstanding until you are ready, not because you are afraid, but because you are patient. Most of us know someone who has practiced this kind of strength. Some of us have practiced it ourselves, in ways we may not have named. This story asks, where in your own life have you done serious work that went unrecognized? And what did you do with that? The spring after the divorce, Margaret did something she had been thinking about for 3 years. She called her brother Thomas. Thomas was 49, lived in Providence, and had the easy warmth of a man who has spent his life not being particularly expected to do anything consequential. Their relationship had been defined by affection and a certain genial distance. He was fond of her, she was fond of him, and they had never quite made the crossing from family attachment to genuine friendship. Margaret called him on a Sunday afternoon and asked if he wanted to have lunch. They met at a place in Providence that Thomas liked, a small Italian restaurant on Federal Hill with red-checked tablecloths and handwritten specials on a chalkboard. They ate pasta and talked about their father's recovery, and then they talked about things they had not talked about in years, childhood things, old jokes, the particular quality of Saturday mornings in Deerfield when they were small. At some point Thomas said, with a directness that surprised her, I heard about the expansion. She said. And the divorce. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, turning his fork in his hand. Then, I should have paid more attention. To the firm. To what you were doing with it. You had other things, she said. That's generous. She looked at him across the red-checked tablecloth. Thomas, I didn't call to have that conversation. I called because Dad is getting older and I want us to be actual siblings. Not the version of siblings where we only talk at Christmas. He looked at her for a moment, then smiled in the way he had smiled when they were children, a genuine smile, without the social overlay of adult life. Okay, he said. I can do that. They had lunch again the following month. And the month after that. Over the course of that year, Margaret rebuilt several things, some of them professional, some of them personal. She hired a new director of operations for the expanded firm, a woman named Patricia Reed who had 20 years of experience and a reputation for methodical, trustworthy management. She promoted 2 people who had been undervalued in the organizational structure they had inherited from the original brokerage. She began hosting quarterly dinners at her house on Greenfield Drive for a small group of women in regional business who had, each in their own way, spent years doing serious work in rooms that did not fully see them. The yard got better. She found a nursery in Simsbury that sold mature hydrangeas, and she planted them along the fence in the corner where the drainage was slow, and they took. She spoke to her father every Sunday. She went to the Northeast Regional Business Alliance dinner the following November. She was not at table 11. She was at the head table, as the evening's featured speaker, invited because the Alliance's program chair, a woman named Beverly Cook who had known Raymond Hargrove for 30 years, had called Margaret in September and said, "We'd like you to talk about what you've built." Margaret had considered this for a moment and said, "All right." She stood at the podium in a room of 400 people and she spoke for 23 minutes about building things that last. She spoke about patience and about the quality of attention that serious work requires. She spoke about her grandfather, and about her father, and about what it means to invest in a thing over time without requiring the investment to be visible. She did not mention Douglas. She did not mention the previous November. She did not explain herself. She did not need to. The room listened. The room applauded, not the measured, professional applause of obligation, but the kind that comes from an audience that recognizes something true. She walked back to her seat. Her father was in the third row, his first public event since the surgery, sitting straight in his chair with his coffee cup in front of him and his reading glasses around his neck. He nodded at her when she sat down. She nodded back. That was enough. What this story leaves us with is not a simple moral. The truth of a life is rarely simple, and the lessons that last are rarely the ones that announce themselves. There is something in Margaret Calloway's story that belongs to a great many people who will never make a speech at the Alliance dinner or complete a business acquisition or sit calmly in a ballroom while a room misjudges them. What belongs to all of us is the more fundamental thing, the experience of being seen incompletely by someone who should know us well. The experience of doing work that goes unrecognized. The experience of carrying something serious and private and choosing, for reasons that make sense to us if not to anyone else, to keep carrying it a little longer. And the experience of arriving, eventually, at a place where the carrying was worth it. There is a lesson here about patience, but it is not a lesson about simply enduring. It is a lesson about what you do with the time while you wait. Margaret was not passive during those 11 years. She was building. She was learning. She was protecting what mattered and documenting what was real. Her stillness was not the stillness of someone frozen, it was the stillness of someone in motion at a level the room could not see. There is a lesson here about dignity, and it is not the dignity of triumph or vindication. It is the quieter dignity of a person who knows her own value and does not require the room to confirm it. That kind of dignity is harder to come by than it sounds. It requires a kind of inner stability that most of us have to work for, across years, through failures as well as successes. And there is a lesson here about love, specifically about what love requires of us. Not just romantic love, but the broader love we owe to the people who have shaped us and believed in us. Margaret and her father at that kitchen table, in that house where she had grown up, over coffee cups worn smooth from years of use, that is a love that cost nothing dramatic and gave back everything. The Sunday phone calls. The nods across a crowded room. The way he looked at her and simply saw her, without condition and without revision. That is the love that lasts. People will fail us. They will misjudge us. They will laugh at the wrong moments and ask the wrong questions and call the wrong people for the wrong reasons. Some of them will be people we trusted deeply. Some of them will be people we loved. What we do with that, how we grieve it and how we rebuild, what we protect and what we release, whether we allow it to diminish us or whether we allow it to clarify us, that is the work that only we can do, in the quiet rooms of our own lives, without applause. Margaret Calloway sat still in a ballroom. She did not cry. She did not retaliate. She did not announce herself. She had already done all the work that mattered. She simply waited to return to it. And she did. Thank you for listening to this story. If it brought anything to mind, a person you know, a time in your own life, a question you are still sitting with, the comments are there for that. Stories are how we find each other across the distances of experience. The work continues.